The United States government's total unfunded liabilities, the combined amount of money that has been promised to recipients of Social Security, Medicare, federal employee pensions, veterans benefits, and public debt, stood at $122 trillion in 2019. Today, that number is $212 trillion, and the U.S. debt clock projects it will reach $288.9 trillion by 2028. That is more than $250 quadrillion that has been promised to Americans with no money set aside to pay for it. And I need you to understand what that number means in plain language. It means the United States is committed to spending $212 trillion more than it will ever collect in revenue under current law, not over the next century. As of today, the obligations exist today, the money does not. And there is no combination of tax increases and spending cuts that can close a gap of that size without fundamentally restructuring the relationship between the American government and the American citizen in ways that no politician from either party is willing to describe honestly. Because describing it honestly would require admitting that the promises made to your generation, the retirement security, the healthcare coverage, the pension benefits, the social safety net, cannot all be kept. And that the question is no longer whether those promises will be broken, but which ones, for whom, and how soon. That is the line. The United States crossed it years ago, and the political system has been engaged in an elaborate performance of pretending it did not happen because acknowledging it would require action that is politically impossible. What I'm going to do in this video is show you, with the data, with the specific numbers, with the institutional assessments, every line that has already been crossed. Not lines that are approaching, not lines that could be crossed if we are not careful. Lines that have already been crossed. Irreversibly. And the reason this matters to you personally is that the consequences of crossing those lines are now baked into the trajectory of the American economy, the American healthcare system, the American labor market, and the American retirement system. They will arrive whether anyone acknowledges them or not. The only variable is whether you understand what is coming and position yourself accordingly, or whether you discover it the way most Americans discover structural decline, after it has already consumed something you cannot get back. The demographic line was crossed in 2020 and no policy on earth has ever reversed it. The Progressive Policy Institute published an analysis with a title that should have ended every optimistic economic forecast in Washington: Demographic Decline Appears Irreversible. Their core finding was that no country in the modern world that has fallen below replacement level fertility has ever returned to replacement level through policy intervention. Not one. France has spent an estimated 3.5 to 4% of its entire GDP every year on pro-natalist policies, subsidized childcare from infancy through preschool, generous family tax deductions, monthly cash allowances for each child, and pension bonuses for parents who raise multiple children. The result of that staggering investment was an estimated increase of 0.1 to 0.2 births per woman, and in 2023, fewer children were born in France than at any point since World War II. The United States birth rate has been below replacement level since 2007, and it has declined every year since. The U.S. population growth rate was 0.52% last year, the lowest level, with the exception of 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic, since the nation's founding. Since the founding, and Brown Advisory documented that immigrants have made up approximately 80% of U.S. population growth since 2020. Immigrants account for 14% of the population but are responsible for 36% of aggregate innovation and are 80% more likely than native-born Americans to start a business. Nearly half of all Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. And 59% of artificial intelligence PhD graduates working in U.S. industry are international students. And instead of recognizing that immigration is the only mechanism that has ever successfully offset demographic decline in any developed country, the United States has implemented policies that produced an unprecedented 2.2 million decline in the total foreign-born population in the first half of 2025 alone. That is not a reduction in new arrivals. That is a shrinkage of the existing immigrant population. People who were already here, already working, already paying taxes, already raising families, already founding businesses, have left. And a University of Pennsylvania study, published in the journal Intra-Economics, warned that the United States is engineering a self-inflicted brain drain, noting that immigration quotas in the 1920s caused a 68% relative decline in U.S. patenting, and that the country is now __quote_1__. The demographic line is crossed. The birth rate is not coming back. The immigrant population is shrinking. And the Cato Institute calculated that without the contribution of immigrants over the last 30 years, public debt to GDP would be over 200%. The people who are being driven out of the country are the people whose taxes were preventing the debt from being even more catastrophic than it already is. That is not a policy debate. That is a mathematical feedback loop with no exit. And the workforce consequences of demographic decline are already visible in the sectors that matter most. Healthcare and social services made up the bulk of new job creation last year, much of it specifically geared toward helping the aging population, home health aides, nursing assistants, elder care workers. Brown Advisory documented that 39% of home health aides in America are immigrants. Construction, which is critical to the data center build-out that AI requires, is already labor-constrained. And both healthcare and construction are jobs that cannot be automated by artificial intelligence anytime soon, which creates a skills mismatch where the economy needs physical laborers and caretakers. But the policy is driving away the exact population that fills those roles. The aging of the American population without a replacement generation creates a dependency ratio crisis that no amount of AI productivity can offset. By 2034, for the first time in American history, there will be more Americans over 65 than under 18. The Social Security and Medicare trust funds depend on a specific ratio of workers to beneficiaries. When that ratio declines because the working age population is shrinking and the retired population is growing, the math of those programs fails. And it fails permanently, because there is no policy that can retroactively generate the workers who were never born 25 years ago. The demographic line is not a future risk. It is a present condition with a 25-year lag that is already locked in and cannot be altered by any action taken today. The debt line was crossed when interest payments became the largest item in the federal budget and the ratchet locked. According to the Congressional Budget Office, net interest on the national debt exceeded $1 trillion in 2026. That makes interest the single largest line item in the federal budget, larger than defense, larger than Medicare, larger than any program that actually does something for American citizens. The federal government is now spending more money on the cost of having previously borrowed money than on protecting the country or providing health care to its elderly. And the mechanism that makes this irreversible is what analysts have described as a one-way ratchet. When interest payments rise, they increase the deficit. The increased deficit requires more borrowing. The additional borrowing generates more interest. The additional interest increases the deficit further, and the cycle repeats. Each turn of the ratchet is permanent because the debt that generated the interest payment does not disappear. It compounds. The OBBBA added approximately $4.1 trillion to the national debt over the next decade, according to independent analyses from the CBO, the Penn-Wharton Budget Model, and EY. And simultaneously, a Yale Budget Lab analysis showed that the legislation will reduce post-tax and transfer incomes among the bottom 80% of U.S. households while boosting the incomes of the richest Americans. The debt is increasing. The interest on the debt is increasing. The people paying for the debt are getting poorer, and the people benefiting from the tax cuts that created the debt are getting richer. And the three credit rating agencies that have downgraded the United States, S&P in 2011, Fitch in 2023, and Moody's in May 2025, have each cited this trajectory as a primary reason for their downgrades. And recovering from the current AA+ rating back to AAA requires, according to analysts, eliminating roughly half the national debt. Half. That is approximately $17 trillion in debt reduction. There is no plausible political scenario in which $17 trillion in debt is eliminated. No combination of growth, taxes, and spending cuts in any model produced by any institution has shown a path back to AAA within any time frame shorter than a generation. The credit line was crossed when Moody's delivered the third downgrade. The countries that have lost AAA, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, have not recovered it. The United States will not be the exception. That rating is gone, and the higher borrowing costs that come with the downgrade feed directly into the interest ratchet that caused the downgrade. The system is eating itself, and the infrastructure dimension of the debt crisis makes it even more irreversible. The American Society of Civil Engineers has graded U.S. infrastructure a C-, which in academic terms is barely passing. Roads, bridges, water systems, electrical grids, airports, and public transit are all operating under deferred maintenance that now totals trillions of dollars. And the interest payments consuming $1 trillion per year are $1 trillion that is not being spent on fixing the infrastructure that is crumbling. Every dollar that goes to interest is a dollar that does not go to rebuilding the bridge, upgrading the water system, hardening the power grid, or modernizing the port. The infrastructure deterioration is itself a form of debt, an accumulation of deferred costs that grows more expensive every year it is not addressed. A bridge that costs $50 million to repair today costs $200 million to replace in 10 years if it is allowed to deteriorate further. And the federal budget, consumed by interest payments, Social Security, Medicare, and defense, has no room for the infrastructure investment that the economy requires to remain competitive. The American economy was built on infrastructure that was constructed between 1930 and 1970. That infrastructure is now 55 to 95 years old. It was designed for a fraction of the current population, a fraction of the current traffic volume, and a fraction of the current electrical load. And the country cannot borrow enough to replace it because the existing debt already exceeds 100% of GDP, and the interest on that debt is already the largest line item in the budget. The infrastructure line was crossed when the cost of deferred maintenance exceeded the fiscal capacity to address it. The gap is now widening every year because maintenance costs compound while the budget capacity to pay them shrinks. The institutional trust line was crossed when Americans stopped believing hard work leads to economic gain. A September 2025 Wall Street Journal NORC poll found that the percentage of U.S. citizens who believe that hard work leads to economic gain fell to 25%. 25%. 3 out of 4 Americans no longer believe in the foundational premise of the American economic system. That is not a policy failure. That is the collapse of the social contract. The American social contract, the implicit agreement between citizens and their government and their economy, has always been built on a single proposition. If you work hard, you will get ahead. That proposition justified everything. It justified low taxes because the market would reward effort. It justified limited social programs because individual initiative was the path to prosperity. It justified the absence of universal health care because employment-based coverage was available to anyone who worked. It justified the cost of education because the degree was an investment that would pay returns. It justified the retirement system because 40 years of saving and investing would produce security. When 75% of Americans say they no longer believe that contract is operational, the justification for every one of those structural choices collapses. And the collapse of belief precedes the collapse of behavior. When people stop believing that work leads to reward, they stop working as hard. They stop saving as diligently. They stop investing in education. They stop starting businesses. They stop taking the risks that drive economic dynamism. And the economic data confirms that the behavioral shift is already underway. The labor force participation rate for prime-age men has been declining for 50 years. The small business formation rate, while it spiked briefly during the pandemic, has settled back below its pre-2008 trend. The personal savings rate has fallen from 30% during the pandemic to below 4%. The percentage of Americans under 30 who own stocks has declined. The percentage of young Americans who believe they will ever own a home has declined. The percentage of Americans who believe their children will be better off than they are has declined to the lowest level ever recorded. The belief system that powered American economic growth for a century is eroding at its foundation, and restoring belief requires restoring the conditions that created it. Rising real wages, affordable housing, accessible health care, a functional retirement system, upward mobility, and every one of those conditions is moving in the wrong direction. You cannot rebuild trust in a system that is actively getting worse for the people who are being asked to trust it. The trust line was crossed, and crossing it back requires a reversal of material conditions that no current policy trajectory is producing, and the behavioral evidence of the trust collapse is not limited to survey data. A poll conducted after January 6, 2021 found that 79% of Americans said America is quote _2 and the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index reading of 47.6 in April 2026 is the lowest in the entire 75-year history of the survey. The deterioration in sentiment was across age, income, and political party affiliation. The collapse of confidence is not partisan. It is universal. And Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, has publicly argued that widening wealth gaps, rising debt, internal polarization, and diminishing productivity growth erode social cohesion and economic stability in patterns that mirror the decline of every previous global power. Peter Turchin, the complexity scientist who predicted the 2020 crisis years before it happened, argues that growing wealth disparities, a surplus of highly educated elites competing for limited opportunities, and increasing polarization have created conditions that mirror historical patterns of societal breakdown. These are not fringe commentators. These are the economists and historians that institutional investors and policymakers read privately while telling the public everything is fine. The brain drain line was crossed when America went from attracting the world's best to repelling them. The Intereconomics Journal published a study in 2026 titled America's Self-Inflicted Brain Drain that documented the mechanism by which the United States is dismantling the talent pipeline that built its competitive advantage in technology, medicine, engineering, and artificial intelligence. The study documented that the new $100,000 H-1B visa fee will be prohibitive for universities, hospitals, research institutions, and the small startups that historically drove American innovation. Evidence from H-1B lotteries between 2014 and 2018 showed that startups that lost the H-1B lottery were less likely to achieve a successful exit via IPO or acquisition and less likely to receive additional venture capital funding. The fee does not just make hiring more expensive, it kills companies before they are born. And the large technology companies that can absorb the fee are responding not by paying it and keeping the talent in America, but by accelerating the offshoring of skilled work to countries where the talent is available without a $100,000 entry tax. The brain drain is operating on two levels simultaneously. First, the people who would have come to America are choosing other countries. Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Germany are all actively recruiting the skilled workers that the United States is pushing away. Second, the people who are already in America are leaving. Brown Advisory documented that of the 1.5 million reduction in net immigration last year, only 230,000 were deportations. The remaining 1.27 million reduction is people who chose to leave or chose not to come. That is the brain drain effect. The signal that the United States has sent to the global talent market is that America is raising the drawbridge. And talent, unlike oil or steel, can choose where it goes. It goes where it is welcomed, where the paperwork is manageable, where the legal environment is stable, and where the political climate does not threaten to revoke visas on the basis of nationality or religion. The countries that are welcoming that talent today will be the countries that generate the patents, the startups, the medical breakthroughs, and the technological innovations of the next 30 years. And the United States will not be among them at the rate it was in the previous 30 years. The line was crossed when the flow reversed. Talent pipelines, the study noted, take decades to build and can be destroyed with a remarkable speed. The destruction is underway, and the rebuilding, if it ever happens, will take longer than any current voter will live to see completed. The private credit line was crossed when $3 trillion in shadow lending escaped every regulator on Earth. After the 2008 financial crisis, Congress passed Dodd-Frank to tighten the rules on banks and prevent a repeat of the lending excesses that caused the crash. The banks complied, and the lending moved into the shadows. Firms like Blackstone, Apollo, and KKR built a $3 trillion private credit loan book with no capital requirements, no disclosure rules, and no regulatory oversight. No regulator has clear authority over it. Nobody watches it. And the first cracks appeared in October 2025. First Brands, an auto parts company, collapsed. Tricolor, a subprime auto lender, failed amid fraud. J.P. Morgan took a $170 million loss. Jamie Dimon said it publicly in language that central bankers and Wall Street executives rarely use. When you see one cockroach, there are probably more. The private credit market is the subprime mortgage market of 2026. It is a pool of $3 trillion in loans that were made under relaxed standards by institutions that are not subject to the stress tests, capital requirements, or reporting obligations that banks face. When the economy slows, when interest rates stay elevated, when oil prices spike and consumer spending contracts, the borrowers who took those private credit loans, many of them mid-market companies with thin margins, begin to default. And the defaults do not show up on any regulatory dashboard because the loans are not reported to any regulator. The first sign that the private credit market is failing will not be a regulatory warning. It will be a headline about a firm that collapsed overnight and took its lenders with it. And by then, the losses will already be distributed across pension funds, insurance companies, endowments, and sovereign wealth funds that invested in private credit vehicles because the yields were higher than anything else available. Those are the institutions that manage your retirement money, your insurance premiums, and your state's rainy day fund. The line was crossed when $3 trillion in lending escaped regulation entirely. The subprime mortgage market in 2007 was approximately $1.3 trillion. The private credit market is more than double that size. And it has no circuit breakers, no margin calls, no mandatory disclosure, no stress test, no regulator watching. Nothing between the current calm and the next crisis except the hope that mid-market borrowers will continue to service their debt in an economy that is simultaneously being hit by war-driven inflation, tariff-driven cost increases, collapsing consumer sentiment, and a Federal Reserve that cannot cut rates without accelerating the inflation that is crushing the same borrowers that private credit lent to. The conditions that would cause a private credit crisis are the conditions that currently exist. And the mechanism of contagion is different from 2008 in ways that make it potentially worse. In 2008, subprime mortgages were packaged into securities that banks held on their balance sheets, which meant the losses were concentrated in the banking system and the Federal Reserve could intervene with targeted liquidity. In 2026, private credit loans are held by non-bank financial institutions that do not have access to the Fed's emergency lending facilities. If a wave of private credit defaults hits pension funds, insurance companies, and endowments simultaneously, those institutions cannot call the Fed for a bailout. They will be forced to liquidate other assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, to cover the private credit losses. And that forced liquidation will crash the prices of every other asset class, which will trigger more liquidation, which will crash prices further. The feedback loop is identical to 2008, but the institutional architecture is different in ways that make it harder to stop. And no one in Washington is talking about it because the institutions that hold the risk are not banks, and the regulators who are supposed to watch them do not exist. The private credit line was crossed when the volume exceeded the 2008 subprime exposure with zero regulatory infrastructure to manage a failure. That infrastructure cannot be built during a crisis. It can only be built before one. And it has not been built. The acclimation line was crossed when Americans stopped expecting things to get better. An analyst named Brian Hawkins published an assessment of the United States in 2026 that contained one sentence I have not been able to stop thinking about. He wrote that the United States is not falling apart, it is hardening into something less flexible, less trusting, and less cohesive. And then he wrote the sentence that defines the line that America crossed without realizing it. The greatest danger of 2026 is not collapse, war, or recession. It is acclimation. Acclimation. Americans are learning to live with infrastructure that barely works instead of demanding infrastructure that works well. They are learning to live with health care they cannot afford instead of demanding health care they can. They are learning to live with wages that do not match prices instead of demanding wages that do. They are learning to live with institutions they do not trust instead of demanding institutions they can trust. And that learning, that adjustment, that lowering of expectations is the most dangerous line of all because it removes the pressure that would otherwise force the system to reform. When citizens expect improvement, they demand action. When they stop expecting it, they stop demanding it. And when demand for reform disappears, reform becomes politically impossible because no politician will spend political capital solving a problem that their voters have already accepted as permanent. The Washington Post published an analysis in March 2026 asking whether Congress has reached a tipping point of irreversible decline. They quoted Hemingway's description of bankruptcy from The Sun Also Rises, gradually, then suddenly. That phrase, written 100 years ago, has become the description of institutional decay. The gradual phase is invisible because each individual step is small enough to normalize. Each norm that is broken, each institution that is weakened, each trust that is eroded, each function that degrades is absorbed into the new baseline. And the American public adjusts. They lower their expectations by one notch, and then another, until the gap between what the country was supposed to be and what the country actually is becomes so wide that crossing back is no longer a matter of policy. It is a matter of whether the collective will to cross back even exists anymore. And every data point I have cited in this video, the unfunded liabilities at $212 trillion, the demographic decline that no policy has reversed, the interest payments exceeding $1 trillion, the credit downgrades that have never been recovered, the 75% who no longer believe hard work leads to gain, the 2.2 million immigrants who left, the $3 trillion in unregulated shadow debt, the record low consumer sentiment, the 47.6 reading that is worse than any war or recession or pandemic in 75 years of measurement. All of those numbers are describing a country that has crossed the line. Not a country that is approaching it, a country that is on the other side. The question is no longer whether the line will be crossed. It has been. The question is what you do when the country you live in is no longer the country you were promised. And the answer to that question is different for every person watching this. But the first step, the step that precedes every other decision, is seeing clearly where you are. Not where you wish you were. Not where the politicians say you are. Not where the evening news pretends you are. Where you actually are. And if you have watched this video to this point, you are seeing it, which means you are ahead of the vast majority of Americans who are still operating under assumptions that expired years ago. Share this video, not for the algorithm, for the people you care about who are still making decisions based on a version of America that no longer exists, for the people who are still saving as if the dollar will hold its value at the same rate, for the people who are still planning retirement as if Social Security will pay 100% of the promised benefit, for the people who are still assuming their health insurance will exist next year, for the people who are still betting their children's future on an economy that 3 out of 4 Americans have already stopped believing in. The lines have been crossed. The data is clear. The institutions that are supposed to warn you have been warning each other for years. The only people who have not been warned are the people who depend on the evening news for their information. And the evening news is sponsored by the companies that benefit from your not knowing.